Since there is no prep to do, the first step is to prime the model with grey surface primer. Once that's done, I'm base coating the dress with Warboss green. To start laying in some shadows in the creases of the dress, I'm using black green. A bit of back and forth is needed to get the gradient right. Working into the highlights with Skarsnik green, again going back and forth until I'm happy. For the lower part of the dress, I'm using a midnight purple for the shadows, and blending them back in with black green. I then went over the whole thing with a wash of Biel-Tan green so it could pool into the recesses. Because washes tend to dry glossy, I'm just going over the top with some matte varnish to make it all the same finish again. Once that's done, I'm going over areas with a mix of Warboss green and Moot green to identify where I'd like to accentuate the highlights. I'm also using Moot green mixed with Daemonic yellow. I'm using just Warboss green for the lower part of the skirt. Once happy with the placement, I'm then airbrushing on top with Warboss green on top of the areas of the dress, and black green on the shadows of the dress. I'm then going over the edges with Warboss green and Daemonic yellow. I'm going over the bottom of the skirt again with midnight purple and black green. And then I mix some black green with Daemonic yellow and Scurvy green to go over the highlights again. Then it was time to move on to the skin. I started off by base coating the face with pale flesh. I mixed in a little bit of Cadian Fleshtone and midnight purple for the shadows. I then masked up the model with masking putty. I used silicone tools to mould the putty in place. To add some shadow, I'm using some midnight purple that I mixed with pale flesh and Cadian Fleshtone. I'm then softening it with pale flesh. For the red nose and flushed cheeks, I used a mix of pale flesh and Wazdakka Red. Once all the masking putty was taken off, I'm just using a mix of pale flesh, Cadian Fleshtone and a small bit of Wazdakka Red and midnight purple to cover up any areas that were missed from the airbrush. Moving on to the hair, I'm base coating it with a mix of orange brown and buff. I'm also base coating the eyebrows. For the shadows of the hair, I'm adding some chocolate brown to the mix of orange brown and buff, and I'm going over the recesses to create depth. Once that was done, I then free-handed some small lines onto the raised areas with buff to create highlights. I then added the shadows and highlights to the eyebrows as well. To start the eyes, I base coated the entire area with a mix of pale flesh and Wazdakka Red. This will serve as the waterline. Once that was done, I went over with silver grey as the whites of the eye. I read in my research that Magrat wears heavy eye makeup, so I mixed some German grey and chocolate brown and went around the eyeline and bottom lash line. For the iris, I started off with black green and highlighted the centre with Moot green. I used a tiny amount of Abaddon black for the pupil. For the jewellery, I base coated it in German grey, and then went over the top with lead belcher. I base coated the boots with German grey, and then went over with the layer of Black Legion and contrast medium. I did some rough highlights with German grey, and then masked off the area so I could soften the blend with the airbrush. I first used German grey, then light grey, then a mix of German grey and black. For the socks, I base coated them with light grey, and then I free-handed some red stripes with gory red. For the flowers, I base coated them with silver grey. For the centres of the flowers, I used a mix of Daemonic yellow and orange brown. I base coated the handle of the broomstick with dark rust. For the bristles of the broom, I'm using Gawthor brown. I'm then highlighting the bristles with a mix of Gawthor brown and buff. I masked off either side of the broom and highlighted the stick with a mix of Gawthor brown and Cadian Fleshtone. Once that was done, I could take the masking off. I covered the bristles with Agrak's Earthshade to pull into the recesses, and covered the tie with dark rust. For highlighting the bristles, I used a mix of Gawthor brown and buff. I used some Gawthor brown to highlight the tie. I added some shading to the petals with light grey. For the ribbon on the dress, I used a mix of Warboss green and Moot green. I then covered the whole model in a gloss varnish, then a matte varnish, and went over some details with gloss again, such as the eyes, lips, jewellery and shoes. The final step was to paint the base black and cover it in both a gloss and matte varnish to lock everything in. And that is the model complete.